So today we're joined by our JNCC colleagues. So Dr. Louise Anderson from the Marine Ecosystems team, Matt Smith from the International Implementation team, and Hannah Hoskins from the Ecosystem Analysis team. So Louise is going to talk to us first. So I'll let you make a start, Louise.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. I will just share my screen. So hi, everybody. Thanks very much for coming along to this today. I hope you've enjoyed the rest of the series so far and you found it interesting. So today we're going to run through some of what the JNCC has been up to in the natural capital space. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about the Marine Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme, or the MNCEA. And within that, the JNCC is leading on a foundational evidence project. So my name is Louise. I am a Marine Natural Capital Policy Advisor in the Marine Ecosystems team and have been quite heavily involved in this area of work. So I'm looking forward to talking through it. But the idea for today is I'll just briefly introduce some aspects of this work package or this suite of work, and then we'll talk about what's coming next, essentially. So, effective ecosystem management and biodiversity conservation requires there to be a clear understanding of the relationships between the ecological and socio-economic components of the system. And natural capital approaches are useful in this context because we can use them to assess the quantity, quality, function, and value of environmental assets, as well as the ecosystem services and benefits that are derived from them. And this is useful in offering a coherent framework through which we can assess these relationships and hopefully inform better decision making. So there is an increasing policy drive to do this. And as pressures on the marine environment increase, it's more and more important that we can assess the delivery of ecosystem services, how that delivery might be changing, and how we can tailor our responses according to that. When my slide rolls over. Okay, there we go. So when I'm talking about ecosystem services today, I'm using the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, or CICES, and this breaks them up into sort of three main areas, if you like. The first of these is provisioning services. So these are the material and energetic outputs from a system. We also have regulatory and maintenance services, and these are all the things that are involved with maintaining normal environmental conditions. And then we have cultural services. So these are the physical, intellectual, spiritual, and symbolic interactions that we as humans have with the environment. So having said that there are three nice boxes that I'm going to talk about, I actually really like this figure from Nature Scott, which splits them into four. But I like it because it has some really nice examples. So provisioning services, for example, might include things like fisheries, but also perhaps genetic resources, whereas supporting or regulating and maintaining services can include things like maintaining water quality or nutrient cycling. And then we have cultural services, which can include things like tourism as well as recreation. So those are just some examples for context as I talk about the rest of this. And the Marine Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Programme, or the MNCEA programme, is a 3-year DEFRA programme of work that's done in collaboration with the JNCC, Natural England, CFAS, the MMO, and the Environment Agency. And in its broadest sense, it's been set up to collect data on the extent, condition, and change over time of England's ecosystems and natural capital, as well as thinking about some of the benefits to society. This is a really highly collaborative project, and that's something I want to emphasize throughout. But the JNCC is leading on a suite of work that's focusing on foundational evidence with three main work packages to it. In the interests of people's time and attention spans, I'm just going to focus on two of these today, and particularly what we've achieved in this first year of work. And so I'm going to be talking about the development of a universal asset service matrix. And I'm also going to be talking about how we can use condition assessment to understand marine natural capital and ecosystem services. So starting with the asset service matrix. The asset service matrix is, well, it's a tool. It links natural assets, including habitats and species, to the ecosystem services that those assets provide. So I like this example because it's visually quite simple. But this is an example from a JNCC project in the Turks and Caicos, and it links our assets, in this case habitats, in each row to ecosystem services in the columns. And it categorizes them based on the level of service delivery that you get from that asset, as well as our confidence in that linkage. So that's broadly what they look like and how they work. And what's important to understand about this is that an asset service matrix can therefore serve a dual purpose, both as a database or a data library, as well as a visualization method for that data. And so the Universal Asset Service Matrix is a project led by Ashley Cordingley in our team. And it's a huge collation of existing ASMs and linkages from the literature to create what is essentially a single standardized framework for UK marine habitats and relevant ecosystem services. So this is an enormous data set, but it's really, really cool because it makes it possible to walk between the assets and the services that they provide via the existing literature and other published ASMs, all within one framework so that everything is easily comparable. And this is a really useful resource, both for the MNCEA program, but hopefully more widely as well. And it's been designed to be added to as the evidence base expands and can also be filtered to inform more focused questions around specific assets or specific services. The second work package I want to talk about is using benthic biodiversity indicators for asset condition assessments. And in other words, when I'm talking about this, essentially what we're interested in is what kind of shape is an asset or habitat in? How's it doing? What condition is it in? And how does this influence the delivery of specific ecosystem services? And so what we did first, this is a fairly high level review of what information we already have available to us and is designed as a starting point for future work in the next couple of years. So as a starting point, we looked at 9 indicators that the JNCC already works with. And these are all benthic biodiversity indicators that cover different habitats, different spatial scales, as well as different geographic regions by feature of those, those different habitats. And we started with these because we wanted to know if there were opportunities within what the marine ecosystems team was already working on. And we started really by looking at gaps. So this is a slightly alarming table. I apologize for that. But it is an overview of those benthic biodiversity indicators and the underlying metrics that make them up, and then summarizes their relationship with the ecosystem services. So that might sound familiar. This was heavily informed by the evidence contained in the asset service matrix. And the key takeaway for now is that this set of indicators links more clearly to some provisioning and regulating services than they do to cultural services. This isn't surprising and is a well-known research gap for marine benthic habitats. And they also don't really clearly link with our understanding of energy provisioning as an ecosystem service. So these gaps are areas of future research, and there are a number of groups actually working in this space to address some of these. So it's a really interesting research area moving forward. So in the review, having identified some of those major gaps, we went through each indicator in turn and identified relevant ecosystem services, pressures, and pressure activities that relate to that indicator. And this helps us to develop a fuller picture of what the existing evidence base is within this area. And then we broke down how each one works, where we look at some of the underlying metrics and some of the underlying data streams that actually make up this indicator as a whole. So this is an example, this is PD2 or population dynamic, and it was designed to assess fishing pressure. So there's already a very clear linkage there with food provisioning services. However, it also uses longevity as a species trait to inform these impacts. And that in of itself presents opportunities to understand additional ecosystem services. And this is because longevity broadly indicates life history strategy, and it's possible, therefore, to make inferences about other functions and ecosystem services. So, for example, in the English Channel and the southern North Sea, long-lived species are predominantly bioturbators, while short-lived species tend to be suspension feeders. And therefore, because we have this information on longevity funneling into this indicator, um, those different longevity to biomass compositions of various benthic communities can inform on the types of regulatory services that might be provided by a given habitat. So it's an identification of opportunities as well. And overall in this review, we found that underlying metrics are more directly applicable to ecosystem services and natural capital perspectives than the indicators themselves. And this isn't particularly surprising, and also it's not a failure of the indicators at all. It just means that those indicators were designed for something else. But it does give us a really nice starting point to better understand ecosystem service delivery by some of these benthic habitats. These indicators focus on fishing impacts. So these are the key pressure. That is the key pressure that was covered under these indicators, but other pressures, including climate change, will also need to be addressed in the future. So this is very much an initial look. We identified some key gaps for cultural services, and we also identified a really important step moving forward, which is what some of our work in the next coming year will be, which is to quantitatively assess the relationships between individual condition metrics and the delivery of ecosystem services. And this is really important to identify if there might be tipping points in nonlinear relationships that lead to, a drastic decrease in the provision of a certain service because that condition of that asset has reached a certain tipping point. So that's going to be really interesting. So this has been quite a high-level overview of what we've been up to. But together, these projects have made really important progress in assembling the knowledge and the evidence frameworks we need to apply natural capital approaches. We've identified some important gaps, and so future work will aim to address some of these, but we are also another thing. So we're also working on understanding the needs of different stakeholders who might use that asset service matrix. And this is something that's going on at the moment. And we're setting it up so that the asset service matrix can be refined and rolled out in a way that makes it as useful and as accessible to people as possible. Work for next year includes applying what we've learned and thinking about how natural capital approaches can be used as part of an understanding of good environmental status and how this informs ecosystem services and the goods and benefits we derive from them. And also, we're working really closely with other ALBs in a lot of this work. So the examples I've mentioned here are quite focused on the ecology of natural capital approaches. That's by feature of me being an ecologist, so sorry about that. But the socioeconomics of natural capital is really, really important, and it's a growing focus area for the MNCEA as a whole. So, for example, the JNCC will be supporting Natural England on projects around place-based natural capital approaches. And the idea here is to support local and strategic planning for marine recovery, and this includes testing some case studies and thinking, really thinking about how these sorts of approaches how they apply and how they would practically work in decision-making processes. So I will leave it there for now. Thank you very much for listening. I think there'll be some time for questions at the very end, but do feel free to get in touch if there's anything you'd like to discuss further in the meantime. Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. That was a really great summary. I think we've got Matt up next, if that's okay, Matt.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
he seems to be nice and clear now.
Yeah, brilliant. I shan't move then. I shall stand on one leg in the middle of the room, not breathe. So firstly, thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you all today, and thanks all of you for finding the time to come and learn a little bit about the natural capital work. So I've been asked to talk about Latin America, but what I'm going to do is give you a brief potted history of the natural capital work within JNCC, and the reason being two reasons. One is after clearing out Monkstone House a couple of months ago, I realised just how far JNCC has come from where we started with ecosystem services and natural capital to where we are now. And just listening to Louise's presentation there, it kind of really, that really hammered home to me. So what I really wanted to do is just to kind of give people a flavour of what we've been up to, because I also note that we've got a lot of new staff members who who may be for the first time kind of exploring this area and thinking about how it segues with their own work. So yeah, my name's Matt Smith. I'm Biodiversity Ecosystems Natural Capital Manager in the International Implementation Team. So I work directly under Jane Hawkridge and Alyssa Fisher. So as I say, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown really of where JNCC has come since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the National Ecosystem Assessment, a little overview of our business and biodiversity portfolio, which is really where our natural capital work grew, some of the natural capital projects we've been involved with, and I'm just going to finish with our focus on the Latin America use cases, or at least a couple of them. So actually, let's start my timer so I know where I am, because I can't see you all. So some of you remember back in 2005 the Millennium Assessment, and off the back of that, the UK looked at, I'm sure I know some of you were involved in it here on the call, developing the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. And a lot of this was really looking at how to embed the principles of the ecosystem approach, the Convention on Biological Diversity's 12 principles. And just to really kind of remind people what these are about, it was very much looking at understanding how the decisions on the environment are part of wider societal choice, that ecosystem services are a key part of that, and then it's about balancing use and preservation and managing for the long term. But it's important to understand the kind of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, how to involve the whole broad range of stakeholders that have a stake in the environment, how you can bring all of that knowledge to bear, but also consider the externalities of both operations of, say, the private sector, but also the externalities of conservation programming. So if you're focusing on what your conservation project wants to look like, how does that then spill over into other systems and other knowledge systems and other stakeholder priorities? Looking at ecosystem service limits, so the all-important tipping points, realizing that we've got to manage at an appropriate scale, but that change is inevitable. So managing for a snapshot now is not going to be appropriate for 10, 20, 50 years down the line. And understanding how management can be best decentralized to give power to those stakeholders that are most engaged with biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I found this slide because this is what our ecosystem approach projects were in 2012. So at this point, we were still looking at frameworks to try and actually understand what the ecosystem approach meant, not just within JNCC, but also with the CNCBs and other stakeholders that JNCC works closely with, and really fully understanding where, how, and how not ecosystem service delivery can complement conservation management, and starting to think about what does this really mean in the marine environment. And some of the early discussions were with myself, Beth Stoker, and people remember Luca Doria, and to really start to say, okay, we kind of get terrestrial, but what is this going to mean for marine coming forward? And this was the early work on spatial frameworks. So I worked closely with a colleague, Linda Birkin. Many people in the ecosystem analysis team will remember Linda and will remember this piece of work. And this was the first attempt of JNCC working with partners in environment systems to start to understand, right, what are ecosystem services, what information is available. If information isn't directly available, how can we start to develop proxies? How can we start developing a rule base? Now, the rule base that we started with was looking at what it is, the habitat, where it is, the context in the landscape, what it's on, so the soil and geology, and then how it's managed and for what objective. And then what we kind of went into is to understand to what extent can these assets and services be mapped at a spatial scale, and where they can't be mapped, and could they potentially be mapped in the future with better information. Off the back of the NEA, there was a group called Living with Environmental Change. This was made up with senior decision makers across the NCBs and other stakeholders, and it was really to look at how do we implement the findings of the NEA and the ecosystem approach across DEFRA and across stakeholder organisations. So this work was really looking at understanding what is the evidence base, and what are the models of tools that are actually available? Are any of these being used at the moment by any of our stakeholders or other decision makers in other sectors? How can we improve the access and the utility of this evidence and models? What are the new priority evidence and data needs? And then how will this then translate into future funding and investment strategies? And one of the pieces of work that came out of this was work that JNCC, myself at JNCC and others at CEH developed, was developing the first roadmap for monitoring biodiversity, natural capital and ecosystem services to address these 5 key points that I've got on the left. And as you'll notice in the presentation, I've provided links to where this information is. Our first kind of key piece of marine work, which was led by myself and Becky, who's no longer at JNCC, was to look at working. It was a NERC project looking at the decommissioning of offshore infrastructure and understanding the impacts not just on MPAs but also on natural capital and ecosystem services in the marine environment. So we worked with all of these stakeholders that you can see here to start developing those early embryonic asset registers, which Louise has already spoken about, which have come on leaps and bounds since then. So this was back in 2015. And then again, linked to what we were trying to do with LWEC, we worked with the Ecosystem Knowledge Network to develop a tool assessor. Now, this was a brainchild from Helen Baker at the time, which was really taking all of the tools that were out there. And a lot of the users were saying that we've got all these tools, but there's nowhere that's really comparing and contrasting to how they're used, what the caveats are with their use, and really how do we talk to the developers. So a lot of this was around kind of understanding the tools, connecting the users with the developers and the project managers that were looking to implement a lot of these types of tools. And this knowledge was actually refreshed by subsequently by NERC and DEFRA, and it now has its own website within the Ecosystem Knowledge Network. Now in 2015 we started to do some early work in understanding what natural capital, or really what the value of nature was to UK businesses. So in 2015 we did an initial scoping with some colleagues at ACOM. Again, a brainchild from Dr. Baker, which I work closely with her. So we've been thinking about this for quite a long time. So this really started to understand the private sector motivations, how they work, what are the knowledge resources that they have and want to use, what are the barriers to implementation, what are the changes that businesses really want to make, and understanding how knowledge providers such as JNCC and others fit into this wider approach and application of ecosystem services and natural capital. And then following on from this, we really realized that natural capital was spoken about in a broad sustainability. So though people were talking about energy, so if I reduce my energy consumption, I improve climate change, and therefore I have a less impact on biodiversity. And what we really wanted to understand is, because biodiversity is obviously JNCC's bread and butter, what does it mean in terms of biodiversity? What is biodiversity and natural capital? What are the real links there? Not necessarily just sustainability and reducing of resource consumption. So this work really tried to frame biodiversity in the sense of supply chains and the risks associated with biodiversity loss. But as Louise mentioned, about how do you translate those risks into opportunity, and kind of understanding about what are the sectoral approaches which different sectors within the private domain are implementing, and how JNCC can contribute to that, but also learn from it. And the work within the supply chain has come on leaps and bounds. So the stuff that Maddie Harris is leading on with Lawrence and the guys at SEI and Trade Hub really has kind of taken this and gone the extra mile with it. But this is really kind of, I suppose, the bedrock to some of this thinking. We also started to do some early forays into sustainable finance. So understanding, through the lens of the overseas territories, this was done. So understanding how sustainable finance for biodiversity and natural capital is operating, but how does that support nature conservation and the management of natural capital through that lens. So we did an early analysis of a lot of Caribbean use cases, and then started to identify how this could be implemented within the overseas territories. But also this model, as you can see on the right, which was developed by IVM at the University of Amsterdam and Wolf's company, also Dutch-based, who do a lot of work in the Dutch OTs, and we have good collaboration with. Started to help us pick apart, right, how does this work, but where does JNCC fit into that, and where does our knowledge and data fit in? And this has kind of led on to some the work that we're doing now within the Turks and Caicos through the Resabid facility, which is developing a natural capital investment plan, which is looking at how do we get people to invest, looking at, say, public-private blended investment, which is based upon the on evidence and best practice to invest in people and nature and the sustainable green and blue economy. And myself, Dougal, and others are working on that within the IIT. And that's just a small component of a wider work that we're doing, looking at resilient recovery post-COVID-19 in TCI. So just a quick touch on, I'm not going to go into this in detail, and I would suggest, I can't remember to what degree it's been covered in past seminar series, but we've been doing a lot of work in the OT, so I would definitely get you to check that out. Here is the link available to anyone who's not aware of the work that IIT have been leading, particularly, say, through Amanda Gregory. And a lot of that is kind of working with the OTs to look at how natural capital builds environment resilience, how nature fits into economic planning, infrastructure planning, and a lot of the natural capital mapping and valuation that's been supported by the ecosystem analysis team has helped develop those frameworks for integrating, that environmental considerations into planning, policy, and management. So I'm not going to touch on that in any great detail because it's a huge area of work which is ongoing, but just to really doff a cap to it. Now, in 2018, we started looking at a lot of the mainstreaming. So we did some work with University of Oxford through the NERC Valuing Nature programme. And this was where the MEA's multilateral environment agreements were thinking about natural capital and private sector. How do they talk to the private sector? So we did some work at looking at how do you take the biodiversity goals, link them to the sustainable development goals, which the private sector are much more familiar with, and they are more designed to kind of talk to other sectoral needs. And how does that then get kind of translated into private sector relevance and interest? So looking at mainstreaming, reducing impacts, safeguarding, protecting biodiversity, understanding multiple benefits, and then how does this link to enhanced implementation for areas outside? So how does the conservation sector help enhance implementation in other areas? Now, that's available online, but we also managed to get this published within conservation letters within the Journal of Society of Conservation Biology. So again, if that's interest to you, do check that out. Come and speak to me. Happy to discuss. And JNCC were also part of the steering group member, which developed the biodiversity chapter of the Natural Capital Protocol. And again, that is all available for you to kind of consider. And that very much kind of links a lot of the work that we do to the types of natural capital valuation and reporting that the private sector are very much part of now. Again, just touch on some quick concept work we did with Natural Resources Wales, but we wanted to really look at how do we integrate natural capital biodiversity into things like blue and green infrastructure. So this was an early foray into that. Unfortunately, it didn't get past concept stage, but I mean, blue and green infrastructure is a big element of natural capital and the work that we do. So I just really wanted to highlight some work that we did there back in 2017. And JNCC was absolutely critical in kicking off the sectoral working group on business within the Ecosystem Service Partnership, which is a global partnership which brings together the Ecosystem Service natural capital research groups across the world to kind of look at how do they bring the WEES research into application. So myself and Martin van Heelden, who's now working at the Capitals Coalition, really started kicking that work off, which is still ongoing. So yeah, again, just kind of giving some background there, and an excellent partnership and really good way of building links and finding information if you're not aware of it. And I just really want to obviously touch on the Triple Win toolkit, which kind of looks at kind of how do we bring natural capital into a whole suite of sectoral areas. So thinking about the links between biodiversity, climate, but also sustainable development and people who are reliant upon the ecosystem services. And again, I'm not going to go into any great detail, but just making sure that people are fully aware of the resources that JNCC have got under available to us, but also been involved in developing. So that kind of sets out the principles of nature-based solutions for delivering multiple benefits. So just for the last 5 minutes or so that I've got, I just want to touch on some of the work that we've been doing in natural capital within Latin America. And again, as Louise also pointed out, this has been a massive team effort across JNCC. I'm just being the front person here, but a lot of people have been involved. I just want to kind of just bring you back to the spatial framework element of things, because a lot of this early work really was seminal to how we based our thinking on understanding the spatial context of ecosystem services, natural capital, and then how do we bring that down into the kind of the international implementation work that our team and others across the organisation are becoming more involved with. So I'm just going to test you out because it is Latin America on your Spanish here, but really this was kind of the spatial framework in action within Latin America. So kind of factors, the key factors on the left here, so the habitat, the soil, the geology, where it is in the landscape, the asset itself, how it's managed, but then thinking about the function of the system. So how does the infiltration rates of the soil, how does the interception rates of the habitat class, so the foliage, for example, how does the land cover affect the speed of overland flows for management of flood alleviation, but also how is the soil used, particularly say thinking about things such as agriculture and forestry, but then how does that then translate to the benefits? So flood alleviation, reduced cleanup costs such as filtering out of pollutants, improved provision of clean water, but also mediation of environmental risks to improve societal well-being and life well-being. So these are the benefits. And I'm just going to touch on one of the case studies through a project which is EO4 Cultivar, which looked at mapping natural capital within multifunctional agricultural landscapes in Colombia and Peru. Funded by UK Space Agency through the International Partnership Programme, part of the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is how the UK mobilises some of its overseas development assistance. This was a programme of work that was led by colleagues at Environment Systems, and JNCC led the Sustainable Livelihoods work package, which I'm going to just touch upon now. This was looking at Colombia and Peru. So this is the area that we are focusing on we did focus on in Colombia. In northern Colombia, the Magdalena department, Magdalena region, really important biodiversity area, has the Sierra Nevada here on the right of the kind of the left-hand picture. Key biodiversity hotspot, has glaciers, humid forests, and one of the most important wetland areas, the Ciénaga, in northern Latin America. Big banana growth area, so lots of banana and palm oil growing, and the stakeholders there were really keen to understand how EO can help them report on sustainable management, and particularly through certification schemes. Peru was very, very slightly, I'm only just going to introduce you to the area, but it was in kind of dry, arid regions of Peru, heavily adapted ecosystems for mass production here. So irrigated deserts, water shipped in from the Andes for these huge irrigation projects, but super important natural areas which provide a lot of ecosystem services in terms of flood mitigation, mediation of saltwater inundation for the growing mediums, but also aquifer recharge from sea mists, which is kind of captured, sea mist captured in the upper reaches, and then flows into the aquifers that support a lot of the key commercial growers, which you can see here. But for the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on Colombia. So at the bottom, you can see all of the partners that are involved with. On the left, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement with local communities, regional businesses, regional government. And in the middle, it kind of shows a lot of the problems that Colombia was facing within the landscape. So in the winter, they had a lack of very hot, so lack of water. Had a lot of illegal burning, so illegal land clearance, which was adding to soil erosion, higher levels of endemic biodiversity, key biodiversity hotspot identified by the IUCN. But then in the summer, they had too much water. So it was trying to balance these kind of, the water table was a really clear key thing for them. But then working with biodiversity within these productive areas. So the first thing we really did was looking at using the elevation models to delineate the watersheds. Here you can kind of see these watersheds broken down. The bottom right shows you the interconnected watersheds, which gave us our area of interest, which you can see here within the growing region outlined in red. And then what we did some segmentation. So looked at the different types of cover that was there. We started to divide it by the altitudinal zones. So thinking anything like high altitude down to low altitude had different land cover opportunities or land use opportunities, but also different types of habitats. This was the rule base we used, so looking at whether it was vegetation, water, what types of vegetation, what type of bare surfaces, and we started to kind of build up contextual information. So that was the position, the types of habitat, land cover that was there, and then we used this to start looking at hierarchical land cover, and this was the end habitat map. Now what you can do is just on the right here, you could start using these hierarchies to look at different levels. So environmental variable 1, looking at the soil type, 2 was the habitat land cover type, and then 3 was the landform, so where it was in terms of the slope. And it starts to look at what is the rule base to look at ecosystem service provision. And you start getting these types of maps. So the darker areas show where the land area is really good for soaking up water, for reducing that flood risk. Lighter areas less so. We then started to mapping key areas for biodiversity. So for forest areas green, grassland areas orange, and then the wetland areas blue. And then we started doing some habitat and connectivity. So the grey areas are the source habitat, and then the darker green and lighter green show areas where there is need for connectivity for continued gene flow across the landscape for these types of habitats. So that's what we did for all the different land cover types. And this is an opportunity map to show where you can improve connectivity of the different land covers which I mentioned, so forest, grassland, and wetland. And then the interesting part comes when you start looking at, so this is a map looking at areas that are receiving a high amount of water flow into the Rio Frio catchment. And this is a map that's showing opportunities for improving connectivity. So when you start to overlay these two maps, you start getting opportunities for where you can improve connectivity for biodiversity, but also where you can improve land cover to manage overland water flow. So how you can slow it down for flood mediation, but also for improving water stocks. And just to finish up quickly, because I'm running a little bit over time. This is how it's being used. So on the left, some of the businesses are using the maps to prioritize where they should be reforesting, which is part of the needs for their certification schemes. Also to look at how they can understand stocking density to reduce overgrazing and therefore reducing soil runoff, which is affecting the irrigation infrastructure, but also how you can use it to create things like this on the top left, which is micro dams, which provides water for the commercial growers. So this is a really nice example of where stakeholders in Colombia are using natural capital to think about landscape management. I'm just going to really rip through this quickly. Am I all right for time? I know I'm a little bit over. I just need a few minutes to finish. Am I all right?
Yeah, we've got plenty of time at the end, so there's no rush, Matt. You're fine.
All right, cool. Sorry about this. So I'm just going to rip through this. So this is work that JNCC has done with the University of Austral and the Wine Climate Change and Biodiversity Programme. And this is where we kind of built on a lot of the thinking around EO4 cultivar to kind of test out our own modelling. So this again is available. All of this is available online, as is the EO4 cultivar, Peru and Colombia, so you can check it out yourselves. So again, we started off with a habitat map using the Sentinel data, but also thinking about elevation, aspect, slope. Again, the knowledge we built on that kind of that framework thinking. Here's the habitat map. So just to give you an idea, the purple pink on the right is kind of glacier, slow cover. And then on the left, this is the Andes, the Cordilleras. The kind of more green area in the middle is where there's natural forests, where a lot of the agriculture and where the vineyards are. And on the left is like kind of more forest and plantation in the lower plateau, which then goes down to the Pacific Ocean. So this is in central Chile in the Colchagua Valley. And then what we did is we spoke to the stakeholders to think about what are the ecosystem services that are most important to them. So soil management, understanding fire risks, managing water quality and water supply, but then also understanding how biodiversity can really bring support to their production systems. And what we did is we developed a suite of ecosystem service maps, and then we brought all of this complex information together into an application, the Vines application, which showed people how management links to ecosystem service delivery. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show the model. So this was developed by Emma Wright in EAT, Ecosystem Analysis, which again draws in the habitat map a whole lot of different variables. So precipitation, soil, looking at the different management factors, but also where those vineyards are located and meteorological data. And this gave us both modeled output data for the soil loss, but a soil loss output. So this starts to show where you've got high risk of soil loss, which can encroach both on water supply, important for agriculture, but also into the fields themselves, which adds nutrient enrichment, which is not good for maintaining the terroir of the vineyards themselves. Then Alan, who's also kind of left JNCC, developed a bespoke fire risk model based upon an adapted species distribution model. So looking at where the habitat is, what's next to it, and fundamentally building upon all of the information that you can see in the top there, and looking at developing fire output models. So what this looked at was the role in which natural forests can help prevent the spread of fire. So on the left, you looked at what is the likelihood of something is going to catch fire or a fire incident was going to happen. And then on the right was the likelihood it was going to burn. So left is how likely is something could potentially be put at risk of catching fire. Right, how likely it is to burn. And what it shows is actually the native forests are much likely to burn, less likely to burn, and therefore create important fire barriers within the landscape, important within Chile. And then the final was looking at water quality and supply. So we used a SWOT soil water analysis model, looking at, again, the watershed delineation, looking at the hydrological connectivity, the response units, climate, management conditions, and then we ran the model, which gave us these outputs. So fundamentally, what it looked at is water yield. So what is in the water basin, and how does that affect the availability of water, but also the way in which the water, so on the right here, the mean percolation beyond the root depth. So how does that then contribute to aquifer recharge? And we built into the model various relative concentration pathways, which if you change the future CO2 concentrations predictions, it shows you then how this water supply would change with climate change, and then give you kind of climate risk models, which I'm not going to go into for the interest of time. It also gave us opportunity to look at the amount of organic phosphorus and nitrogen that was released into the environment. So to give you an idea, if you're putting extra NP or K into the environment, what impact's that going to have on your ecosystem and ecosystem services? So fundamentally, we built all of those models, and we then connected them into a Bayesian belief network, which looks like one of these. So in a nutshell, we looked at the orange, which is management prescriptions. The blue are the ecosystem responses or ecosystem variables. So you've got things like climate change, subbasin, the amount of vegetation, different chemical contaminants, water discharge. And then the yellow bits are the ecosystem services. So burn management, soil, nutrient enrichment, and biodiversity. And then what we'd use this is to build an R Shiny app. So what the vineyards can do was select on the left there their vineyard, and then on the left here they could put in those different managements. So those orange nodes then came into these different managements. And then what you could do is down here, the different climate scenarios, and then you can plot. And what this does is give you a proof of concept. So based upon what we know about the performance of the ecosystem, plus the performance of the land management, how well you're doing for these different types of ecosystem services. So the proportion of it is going to be good, moderate, or poor in this context. So what this really showed is how you bring complex information to help decision makers understand their role in ecosystems. And what we're doing is building on this in viticulture too. So I've been speaking to the protected area managers within Chile, private protected areas who are looking at understanding natural capital to support their management, building on the viticulture to look at how it can be brought into forestry, but also infrastructure management. We also had a workshop last year through the Copernicus user uptake with the University of Chile, understanding how Copernicus data is being used in natural capital and ecosystem service mapping. All of that information is available on the links below on our website. Resources available with University of Chile, Centre for Mathematical Modelling, CMM. And that's it. That's kind of a whistle-stop tour of where we came from, where we're at. If you need anything, do drop me a line, either on my JNCC or my personal email. Just to say, I put my personal email there is because I just want to let people know I am leaving JNCC at the end of March, the end of the financial year. So if any of this kind of comes up, and by that point I have left, then by all means, I'm not going completely into the ether. I won't be at JNCC, but you're always welcome to reach out via my personal email or my LinkedIn. So I shall leave it there. I'm really sorry for running over. That's me.
That's fine. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, that was really interesting, and I'm really pleased that you gave us a good reminder of all the background projects, quite a few that I need to now ask you about before you leave. But yeah, that was really interesting. So thanks, Matt.
I hope it was.
And
I hope I didn't bore anyone.
Hannah's up next.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, and it's actually going to be both me and Paul
Oh,
Robinson.
brilliant.
Yeah, sorry, because there are things that he will explain to you much better than I will be capable of. But no, thanks, Matt, actually for giving that good reminder of everything that everything that has gone before. And so I'm going to talk a bit about all the different projects that are happening within the ecosystem analysis team. So myself and Paul are both within that team, and much of the work that we do relates to sort of species surveillance, Earth observation and analysis, and the interpretation of those data sources, and much of that pertains to natural capital and different approaches. So yeah, it's going to be a bit more high level and just a bit of a whistle stop tour. And I suppose the key thing I want to highlight as well is that many of these projects we do in collaboration with lots of different organizations, ALBs, NGOs, etc. And it is definitely a very collaborative approach that we take, and also that many of these projects have been told to me by my colleagues, or they're projects that my colleagues are carrying out. So I hope that I represent them correctly. So yeah, Paul, if I can have the next slide, please. So yeah, so the first four I'll just give a bit of an overview, and then I've got some slides for the latter four. So to begin with, just to mention the project that we're carrying out in partnership with the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, creating habitat maps for their use to underpin development and delivery of Northern Ireland's environmental policies, including sustainable food and energy production, natural capital assessment, and climate change adaptation. And these are relevant to mention because valuable insight is gained from such habitat maps when they're integrated in decision support tools and analysed alongside spatial data such as flood risk, air pollution, and carbon sequestration. And so applications can include monitoring habitat change and condition, planning nature recovery networks, and relating actions to outcomes in a wide range of land use and management decisions. And the real hope is that this work can support decisions regarding where to plant woodlands, as this is a major policy aim of NIEA to increase woodland cover across the country. And sort of that integration of habitat maps with that decision making is really key, and is shown also in the work. The next project I wanted to talk about was the Brecon Beacons fire risk modelling tool. So as a bit of quick background, this came about because of the consequences of dry summers and decreased grazing on the I can't say it very well, I'm afraid, Manith D Massif, which has led to concerns about fire risk, and like I say, in that combination with dry summers, led to moorland fires across the UK. And this, of course, had major ecological impacts, including and in particular loss of habitat, and it also cost a large amount of money to tackle, and resulted in significant release of carbon into the atmosphere. So it's fair to say that this issue is an important one, and that particularly, I mean, with relevance to the fact that, of course, this summer we had another very dry summer, and this increased fire risk in the future is a real threat. But we do know that where natural capital is well managed, this can aid fire risk reduction. So JNCC, along with colleagues Brecon Beacons National Park Authority and Natural Resources Wales, built a proof of concept as an accessible support tool to land managers to drive sustainable decision making at the landscape scale. And of course, the focus for this was on that fire risk reduction, but the point is that that we want to enable multiple areas of natural capital understanding and how to manage best to better these. And so the chosen approach can provide information on potential relationships of land management across different areas and with other benefits such as water quality and carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And then the next project is the England peat map project, where we are supporting as part of the technical advisory group, and we're testing EO methods for monitoring levels of bare peat and burn scars from imagery, working with Northern Ireland and Scotland on those tests and sort of building that. And we will also be testing how landscape evaluation data can be used to assess changes in wetness and vegetation cover at restoration sites. So thinking about the natural capital asset of peat there. And then finally on this slide, before I go into the other ones, is just to also highlight that within our team, we do a lot of work on species surveillance, and we co-manage alongside various NGOs a plethora of national citizen science species surveillance schemes, and these provide high quality data to understand the UK's biodiversity natural capital asset, and this is both in regards of how well species are doing in their own right, but also how well habitat might be functioning. So I'm going to, Paul, if you can move on to the next slide. So the next project I'm going to talk about is the one which is the Global Environmental Impacts of Consumption tool, which Matt mentioned that there was some follow-on work from the business risk of biodiversity loss, and luckily they have produced a video, so you don't have to listen to me badly explain it. So yeah, Paul, if you can hit play. We're going to put it on closed captions because I don't think the sound will work. Sorry about the lack of sound, but also just to really highlight that it's well worth going and checking out that work that is being done. And so yeah, the next project that I'm going to tell you about is another piece of work around the it forms part of, I suppose, this is the work about thinking about land use policy making and natural capital approaches to support this. And this work forms part of the wider transition from the countryside stewardship, which was the previous agri-environment scheme, into the new schemes. And these are related at different spatial scales. And I suppose for background, the point is that there are many emerging policies, and of those there are many levers to pull which can help us as an organisation tackle net zero, biodiversity loss, food security, amongst other things. And many of these policies have a focus on one priority, so net gain, net zero, but some will address multiple focuses, such as farming with nature schemes. And so this work on land use is increasingly focused on considering how an action could deliver benefits and disbenefits across a range of objectives. And the assessment clearly requires a robust evidence base, because it's around the way in which we use our land, but also to consider as to how we practically communicate that evidence in a way that will allow flexible responses by land managers and enable local priorities to be considered and keep them simple enough to be understood. So this is where the work on spatial prioritization comes in, with the mantra being to do the right thing in the right place to achieve multiple benefits. So no small task. So if we can have the next slide, please, Paul. So yeah, so JNCC are working with partners to pull existing data together to create spatially explicit ecosystem service demand layers, such as air quality regulation, which can be used to not only target actions to suitable areas, but also overlay those layers to help prioritise decisions that will have positive impacts across multiple services, including biodiversity, as well as people's livelihoods and their well-being. So it's kind of taking that holistic approach. And we engage with stakeholders and achieve co-design so that we can help folk understand options available, doing so through a natural capital lens to make it clear both how the land can be managed in an environmentally positive way and the benefits that will provide. So as you can see from this diagram, so looking at sort of the various different natural capital concepts, so thinking about which services, so where the actions may be needed is the policy point of that, and then where the assets are, so where it could be done, and then sort of the impacts and that meaning what's the benefits and combining those. So that's the broad concept, and again we'll share a link in the last slide. I hope if I remember to put it in to talk a bit more about that. But that's a really interesting, exciting way of thinking about sort of the multifaceted aspects that go into thinking about land use decision making, but also doing so in such a way that people can make good decisions without having to be tech savvy, and hopefully that's a sort of a running theme. So one slide back, please. Well, no, one forward. Yep, thanks, Paul. So yeah, another piece of work on that list of things that we're doing in the ecosystem analysis team is that we are building and have produced a proof of concept on understanding soil health. And so for this project, we're aiming to shift how soil health is defined to better consider soil health as the ability of a soil to perform its functions, and the range of functions and the ecosystem services provided by a soil should reflect the different capabilities of different soils, but also as well as the many factors that impact a soil's ability to deliver ecosystem services. So the point being that there are inherent properties of soils in specific places that will determine the functions that soil in that place will have. But then, of course, that is also affected by land use and management decisions, and it's trying to sort of think about the fact that a healthy soil is one in which ecosystem services are provided at an acceptable level given inherent underlying constraints, but also land use. And so where qualified, the term soil health can be used in relation to particular functions / ecosystem services. But the point being that soils often are one function of an overall ecosystem service that's trying to sort of understand that chain of thinking. And it's worth noting that a fuller picture of soil health will require consideration across ecosystem services. And so I think go on to the next slide now, Paul. So some constraints are relatively fixed, others are easier to change, and it's important to be able to view soil health of a particular land parcel in the context of what should be expected of the soil bearing in mind the fact that some of these constraints are fairly fixed, some are movable, and also then the land use. And so we built a conceptual, we built this sort of way of making this conclusion through creating conceptual models that sort of understood those different various constraints and what that meant for the way a soil would perform, and built them into Bayesian belief networks. So you may think that this sounds very familiar to the vineyard work that Matt mentioned, and the point is that we're drawing on previous JNCC work to understand complex problems and such as soil health, and sort of applying those to these contexts. So the idea being that therefore, again, once that understanding at that parcel stage, of course, that needs to be meaningful. So we're working on a mechanism as to how best to depict what is quite complicated. And so we've produced a dashboard as a proposed mechanism by which to do this, which we are, at the moment it's just a proof of concept, but the point is that through the things that can be measured around soil properties and an understanding of what the land is used for at that place, the ability to provide a function towards the service can then be depicted. And so, for example, on the arc that's showing climate regulation, the arrow is the line across the arc is the ability of that soil, this example soil, to provide the function towards climate regulation. However, that soil type, so those constrained properties that can't ever change, mean that that soil could only ever be as good as that top bar, or only be as poor as the bottom bar. And so it's that idea of the fact that these things don't exist, are constrained by things that are beyond management capabilities, and sort of like I say, I mean, a key element of the work is the aim to make the complexities of natural capital approaches accessible to a wider audience, and we want to provide tools and communication resources to improve people's understanding of the available evidence and make informed decisions and understand that things are as they are. So can I have the next slide, please, Paul? So the final thing on the list that I'm going to talk about, and then Paul's going to talk about it from another angle, is local change detection through citizen science. So we want to collect data to build an evidence base on the extent and condition of the UK's natural capital. And like colleagues speaking at the start, we are also part of the Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Project, which is alongside lots of different ALBs. And citizen science is one of the cross-cutting tools we have for collecting the data that build this evidence base, alongside professional surveys and then Earth observation, which Paul's going to discuss shortly. And obviously, citizen science is already an essential to environmental policy, forming the majority of current biodiversity monitoring in the UK. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that it tells us both about how species are doing, and then also about how habitat might be functioning, and is key to many of various different targets that we use. But our aim in this work area is to provide standardized protocols, improved recording tools, and advice on the appropriate adaptations to produce better data to understand nature recovery across multiple scales and uses. And through collaborations, we'll increase engagement. We aim to increase engagement with nature, with a repository of recording tools for citizen science made accessible to support data flows to national partners and back to users, to allow a range of uses by local actors and national policymakers around sort of understanding local change and natural capital. So an example of that would be work that has taken place in UKCH to produce a tool called eSurveyor, which uses AI identification of plants and summarizes the pollinators supported within the quadrat where the photographs of the plants are taken, and that is then sort of collecting data on the species makeup, but providing feedback to the user of the tool. So it's kind of this idea of the inherent necessity for decent feedback to data collectors, such that we have the data gets collected. So the idea is to, I suppose the ultimate idea is to understand local change through citizen science, to produce this better data, to understand nature recovery, and then be able to understand that across multiple scales and uses. So I'm going to pass it over to Paul to talk about local change detection through Earth observation. And I suppose the other thing, Paul, I'm sure you may mention this, is the fact that there is the ultimate aim to marry these two things up, because one existing without the other is we would be detrimental, and we want to further integrate these different aspects of our work.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Now all of a sudden it won't move on. Okay, so I'll just very quickly mention this last project, because Hannah's done a vast majority of the work, but this last element is, as Hannah mentioned, using Earth observation data and trying to make use of the considerable archive of imagery that we now have building up, which is ever increasing now and is readily available to use. And the idea behind this approach is to systematically summarize index values that we can calculate from satellite imagery, in this case from a series of satellites called the Sentinels, and summarize them by habitat parcels. And it's important that we link these data to habitat information that we have in habitat maps, and then deliver it to non-specialist users. So we're delivering it in a way that people don't need to be image analysts to actually understand. And by utilizing this time series of data means that we can present information to allow people to see how things are changing over a period of several years. We can go back to 2015 with this data, and understand the management and what's happening at a land parcel scale. So the challenge of doing this, as I say, we have a massive archive of imagery building up, but actually making this work in a sensible way at scale across a whole country is a major technical challenge, which we've been working on. We did last year a pilot testing it to work at covering the county of Yorkshire in the area shown on the map on the right there, which was extremely successful in developing the technology to deliver that. And we've now moved on to process the data for all of England, and we also have areas of Scotland as well covered, so that we can start testing the data in that. In England, it's linked to the Living England habitat map, which is a newly published habitat map, and produced by Natural England. And the idea then is to generate this time series of data, produce it in terms of, as I say, this variety of indices that we can calculate from the imagery, which gives us a proxy for productivity of vegetation. So we can see where vegetation is growing healthily and strongly, and where that changes, and how it's changing over the seasons. We can say something about the wetness at the surface, or the amount of moisture in the vegetation, and burning as well. And we're working up to being deliver something on structure as well, which comes from radar satellites. So just an example there, we can calculate a water index or a vegetation productivity index, and it reduces the data to a more manageable sort of level of complexity. And then by associating with the habitat maps gives us that ability to interpret what we would expect to see, and what the signals are actually showing, and whether that's telling us something about the management or the condition of the habitat at that location. And so the app then highlights polygons that are showing significant variation from other polygons of the same habitat type in that region, and it delivers it through this web app that is showing users the data in a map that they can hopefully understand in graphed outputs, and then also these thumbnails across the bottom, which can show you either a true color image from the satellite or show you the actual index values and show you how these things are changing. So this example is a meadow that flooded during February in 2020, and we can see that that peaks in the lower of the two graphs there in February. You can see that peak, and it's highlighted as it's going beyond the grey ribbons, which is the mean values for the similar polygons in the area. And then this is an example of a heathland polygon that was burnt during January in 2020. I think this one was a wildfire, and again you can see that's picked out in the index values, and users can zoom around the map, click on any polygon they want, and it will generate this data at a very rapid rate. And we're working on ways then we can present this in better ways, how we can analyze this sort of data over regions, and as Hannah mentions, start to integrate the sort of species and habitat data that we collect on the ground, so that would help users actually interpret what they're seeing, so that they can make judgments about the management and the condition of these habitats, and whether they're showing any signs of concern in terms of that condition change. So just to try and summarize all of that, there's a series of links there about various aspects that we've talked about here. But I think overall, really, it comes down to all of these things that we've been talking about are all about supporting decision making to try and improve our natural capital resource, but focusing on a wide variety of different elements of that natural capital, so species, habitats, soils, land use, and then even consumption. So it's all about trying to enable people to make decisions about where changes need to be made, and also assess where changes have been made, what is the impact that's been made. And going back to the example that Hannah talked about at the start in the Brecon Beacons, it's sort of integrating these data into tools that help people, non-technical people, explore the impact of the decisions they're taking on their land, and how they how that's impacting on the size a change in ecosystem service provision as a result of those decisions. So I'll leave it there. Sorry, Lauren, I think we've overrun as well.
No problem at all. Yeah, thank you very much to Hannah and Paul, and for all of our speakers. I think we've got a much more comprehensive overview of what's going on now, which is really great. So I'll have a look at the Slido and see what questions we've got. So we've got one for Louise, which says that you mentioned translating impacts into opportunities in the marine environment, and what that looks like in reality.
Yeah, so I'm glad somebody asked this question, because I think perhaps I wasn't very clear. What I meant by that was that there are opportunities within the existing indicators, the existing benthic biodiversity indicators, to think about impacts beyond fishing, which is why I talked about that example with longevity as a species trait. So I hope that clears it up. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, and also if anyone wants to put their hand up as well and ask one in person, that's absolutely fine. Thanks, Louise. And then there's one for Hannah, which says, have we or anybody else cracked the problem of how to measure peat depth at a useful scale?
Paul, yeah, go on, Paul.
I'll try and jump in on that one. So ultimately, the only realistic practical way of measuring peat depth is with a big stick, and in England that is what is happening. So the England peat map, which we are supporting, has a whole field survey element to that project, which is going out over 2 years, and it's looking to the aim of that project is to assess the extent, depth, and condition of peatlands across England. So the extent is being assessed through the field data collection, which includes depth, but also a modelling element as well. So it's modelling the extent and depth in between all of the points that are being collected. But no, we certainly can't do it from satellites, from space, unfortunately. So it is sending people out in boots with an auger to do it.
And thanks, Paul. I think another important point around soil measurements and I know the person was referring to the peat map, but then thinking about the soil health project is that there are, as mentioned in the question, there is still a number of challenges around monitoring soils and consistency and approaches, etc. And so a key part of that soil health project as well is like allowing for different types of monitoring to be input into the Bayesian belief networks, so we're not losing data from that side of things. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thanks. I wonder if you can do it with LiDAR, but I suppose that's really expensive. So easier said than done.
No, like we do well in England. There is now a national LiDAR survey, and Wales is just completing one. But no, it won't penetrate to any depth. So it will tell you about the structure of the vegetation that's growing on the peat, but it won't penetrate deep enough to tell you anything about the depth of it.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware.
And there's another one which says, Paul, could you give some examples of envisaged target users of the change detection web app?
Great, interesting question. So when we first started thinking about that, we were really thinking about people like regional officers for country conservation agencies who are managing areas and monitoring protected sites, and using it to target the field resource they have, and doing things like that, and trying to identify areas where there's considerable risk of degraded condition. But actually, the more and more that we've talked to a wider variety of users, that sort of vision has grown in terms of who we see is using it. We've certainly been dealing with wildlife trusts, national trust, local record centres, and ultimately we hope that we can start, as Hannah highlighted, integrating data collected by volunteers and actually having making all of this available to volunteers as well, so they can see the impacts of what the data they're collecting as well. So actually, I think I'm not convinced we've got to the bottom of the extent of the users we hope to engage with.
Okay, thank you very much. And then one from Matt, which says, is there anything about tools developed for OTs that would make them unsuitable for use closer to home?
Just quickly, what I really love is the fact that all of this flash technology that we've all been talking about, it comes down to someone being in the field with a massive stick still. So I think, it's really important point that Paul kind of makes, is that all of this is kind of taking conservation knowledge, data, ecology, biology, but putting it into a different kind of frame for different questions for different people. So it's not like reinventing nature conservation, it's like bringing nature conservation to different parties. So, but I like that. The big stick was my favorite part of this discussion, I think. But to answer the question directly, so this is where like ecosystem analysis team go, no, but I say, no, there isn't anything stopping you using these tools closer to home. I think, from the presentation that Hannah and Paul gave, and then the presentation that I gave with the viticulture, you can see how these tools have evolved from the early spatial framework, which I think Paul will remember was just a massive spreadsheet, and everyone was like, well, this is completely useless, no one's going to know what to do with it, to, the dashboards we're developing now. All of it is relatively the same types of information. The information's only getting better. So the simple answer is no. The viticulture stuff was all open access. It's all open source code. So it can all be reused, repurposed. The only thing is the contextual information that would need to change, and bearing in mind that UK is a very data rich environment, especially in comparison to other places in the world. So the simple answer is no, you can use it.
Can I just jump in on that as well, just to add to that? I agree, Matt. Yeah, the contextual information would be different. The big difference then is scale and data volumes, and so then you've got to worry about the infrastructure on which you can deliver this sort of data, which is the sort of thing we've been looking at in the change detection app. You know, the data volumes become huge very quickly, and so yeah, you can't just deliver them in our Shiny and things like that. You've got to have dedicated systems and infrastructure sitting behind it to actually do that sort of thing. So that is a drawback. But we have a fantastic digital and data services team who can develop these things, and that makes it really exciting.
Yeah, they've been critical to a lot of this. DDS team really have. They sat quietly behind the scenes, but massive part of it all.
Yeah, definitely. We've come to the end. So thank you very much again to all our speakers, and we probably could have stayed longer and chatted, but yeah, I won't keep everybody. But yeah, thank you again, and maybe we should do another one.
I've got answers to those questions, Lauren, so I can, the other two questions, I can send you the answers and you can send it to the people who answered, asked.
Oh, that would be brilliant.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you
Cheers,
very much,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Ciao,
Thank you.
ciao.
That was great. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.